I am again Kevin Repp. I'm the curator of modern European books and manuscripts at Beinecke and the curator also of the current exhibition Art, Protest, and the Archives, which is really a very exciting show. I really do hope that you can come and see it. It's something that is really, for me, also a culmination of many, many things. It's certainly the culmination of many years of collecting and many collaborations across special collections at Yale, and really in a certain way, it's a culmination of my career. So it's really quite a wonderful moment. Before I move on to talk about the show a bit, I would like to thank several people by name and others by allusion, at least. There were so many people involved in making this show what it is. It's really quite remarkable. First of all, Carrie Sankum and Megan Checkeye and the rest of the team with the exhibition team who have just, I mean, really made this show much better than it would have been if I'd been left to my own devices. Let's say that for sure. And I also want to thank Rebecca Martz, who did the design for the small brochure and the labels, and also the image you're looking at there on the screen right now. And the community engagement folks, Michael Morand and Tobias Cropper in particular, have just really done a lot. And maybe we'll hear more about that over the course of the semester, about how this exhibition is really being there's a lot of programming around it that's aimed at reaching out to local communities in the area, and I really appreciate all the work they've done to help that happen. It's something that means a lot to me. My fellow curators, Melissa Barton, Josh Cochran, Nancy Cool, and two who are no longer my colleagues on the but still friends, George Miles and Tim Young. They are people whose collections feature very strongly in this exhibition, but I've also really had to lean on them for a lot of their expertise in areas. I am the curator of European books and manuscripts, so American history, although I certainly am an American myself, is not my strong suit. So I've been able to explore those collections and really have enjoyed that. Beyond that, the conservation team at Special Collections have done a remarkable job. And I would like to thank Jen Castellan in particular. Finally, just all the Yale faculty who have been working with me on building the collections and on also using those collections in the classroom. And finally, everyone who's on the Art and Protest mailing list. I want to thank everyone for all the tremendous support I've gotten from that. So with that out of the way, I will just try as quickly as possible to give you a little overview of the topic, the questions that the exhibition is trying to ask, what the show is shaped like, and then maybe a favorite object of mine. People seem always like to hear about that. Just two things. One, if I run on too long, Michael, please tell me that I'm running on too long. I would like to hear from people. And the second one is, if I don't make it that far, I've already mentioned some of the programming. There's going to be a lot of programming, so stay tuned. This fall will be a lot of things around the show. But most importantly, coming up this month already is the opening on September 29th. And there will be a lot of fantastic people from the history of art and protest. A lot of old art and protesters who live in the New York area will be coming up for that, and a lot of other people. So it'll be a chance to really mingle with some of the people who made the history that's on display in the show. So moving on, just first of all, why art and protest? The immediate reason for the show is really the latest wave of art and protest that swept across this country beginning in 2020, really with the Black Lives Matter protests, the George Floyd protests. You see an image here by Jada Gray Eagle from Minneapolis. Um, this moment coincided, as we all know, with the pandemic, and at that time, we were all of us curators were kind of sidelined and not able to actually be in the building with our collections. And so I was really struck by this surge of interest in art and protest, and as a result of that, I began a um, a webinar series just called Art and Protest, which really examined primarily the contemporary burst of art and protest, which included not only Black Lives Matter and that, but also, for example, the Standing Rock, the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, and going back before that, Occupy. And then there's really been, since the turn of the century, quite a remarkable upswing, not only in America, but really around the world and that. So the Art and Protest series, if you're interested in it, you can see hopefully you can see the web address for the site, the Art and Protest site. You can find recordings of a lot of those exhibitions there. And you can also find those if you just Google Art and Protest Beinecke and YouTube, and you will find those videos also that way. So this is an exhibition that's really speaking to the moment very much, but also trying to speak to the moment in a way that engages in dialogue with previous moments and previous movements and previous generations, also across geographic areas. Europe and America primarily, but I'm really looking forward to being able to engage with folks from around the world, and many people who are involved in the Art and Protest project are very active in other parts of the world, South America, for example, Africa, and Asia, and so forth. This exhibition is really the culmination of that as well, the Art and Protest series and the project. Taking back a broader look at it, it's really, at least for me and my collectings, the years I've spent at Beinecke, really been focusing primarily on the post-war period and trying to document the interaction between art, literature, and social activism in Europe since 1945. This is just the homepage for my website, Post-War Culture at Beinecke. You can just Google that and find it easily. Here is a map of the collections that I've been building over the last 15 or 20 years. And you can see a lot of poetry and visual movements and theater, and a lot of things that come up in the exhibition from the European side are really on this. But behind that, you can also see happenings, John Cage, living theater, things coming in from the Americas. And it's really this fruitful interaction that's been the focus of my collecting over time. And so the exhibition is really one that has grown out of this fascination of mine with this interaction. And the question in particular that the exhibition asks overall is one that I think the collections that we have at Beinecke have been building tries in some way to give some source material for starting to try to answer that question, is why art? I mean, it's not really that obvious necessarily that protest movements would look to art as a vehicle for social change. And the reason for that is primarily, I mean, just traditionally, that art has been seen as something that's not supposed to be immersed in the everyday conflicts of life, to use the phrase that people who study aesthetics often use. It's disinterested, which means that it's apart from conflicts of interest in the present, and our enjoyment of it is an enjoyment of it that doesn't touch on any of that. So why would something as otherworldly and really, something that takes place in galleries and museums ordinarily and that sort of thing, why would activists turn to art for that? And behind that question, really, are a whole bunch of other questions, and here are just a few of them that the exhibition is interested in looking at. Can art really change the world? How? What is the power of art? How exactly? What kinds of art? What strategies and tactics have artists used in the past? Do they work? Is it still art when it becomes engaged in this way, or is that just propaganda? What if an activist art becomes fashionable? What if it becomes a trend and becomes commercialized? And above all, what if, assuming that the answer to many of these questions is yes, that art can change the world and it does work, what is it specifically that art as a form of protest can do that other forms of protest are not capable of doing? So those are the big questions behind the show. And the answers to those questions, I offer material. I don't answer the questions, but I offer material that shows how people over the past 100 years or so have answered that question in various ways. And the show is actually structured in two different ways. It's structured, first of all, chronologically. There is on the ground floor, the two large table cases give you a chronological kind of overview and narrative of the 20th century of art and protest, starting with the historical avant-garde represented here by one of the Rostep posters of Mayakovsky from the Bolshevik Revolution in the early Soviet period. And on the other hand, the Gay Revolution Party Manifesto, which is one of the pieces that is shown kind of towards the conclusion of that historical overview downstairs. So it's quite a stretch there between the two, and I could talk a lot about it, and I'm going to try not to talk too much about it, but just really to throw up some images and give you some sense for how that narrative kind of goes. So as I mentioned before, it starts with the historical avant-garde, particularly Russian constructivism, Dada, futurism, and surrealism are movements that are important not only from an art historical perspective, but also because these are the movements that really, in the early 20th century, primarily in the teens, 20s, and into the 30s, develop a lot of the tactics and a lot of the strategies, the techniques that become really a part of the staple ways in which people try to use art in order to activate people for the cause of social justice in various ways. And here are just two of those kind of, well, actually three of those techniques up there. The constructivist art, you can see on the left, it's Brigada Hudojnikov, which means the artist brigade from the early Soviet Union. This really striking geometric style, but it's also an image that points to one of the major innovations of that period, which is agitprop theater, which is theater that brings struggle directly to the people. Outside of the theater, tries to get into the streets and out into the countryside even, and is theater that often involves actually using workers themselves, in this case, to be the actors in that. It's something that has very long legs in terms of art protest, and one of the tactics that I focus on a lot. And the other one on the right is AIZ, the German Workers' Illustrated newspaper, which was illustrated by John Hartfield, whose photo montage is really today a classic. It's very rare to find his photo montage actually still attached to the working class newspaper it was intended for. But because art collectors have really cut those images out and turned them into works of art on walls. But the original intent of them was really to motivate working class support. So that's Europe. I also, very quickly try to show how much of the same the avant-garde you can really see being very much influential in the same period. So primarily here we're looking at the 20s and 30s in the United States. You can see the obvious connection to constructivist art there. These are a few of the magazines from the period that are in our Yale collection of American literature. At the New Theater, it's got some very striking poses of agitprop theater there. But also new masses. One of the things that sets Europe and America apart a bit in these years is that in America, next to class struggle is a form of social struggle. Issues of race immediately come to the fore, and really that tension between class and race in America, in terms of how that works out, is something that I try to look at, albeit briefly, in the historical survey, and then something that clearly comes back again and again in the post-war period. Speaking of the post-war period, just very briefly, I do more or less the same thing there, look at some of the tactics that the avant-garde introduces, the situationists and their strategy of détournement, which is a kind of scavenging of material from popular culture and mashing it up in ways that has a subversive intent, is one of those. And you can see that a bit here. But then on the American side, really the story is quite a bit different. There are the groups involved to a large degree are different, and I focus on several different groups in America of this time. One of them being, as you can see on the right, the Black Arts movement, the Black Panthers, the whole Black aesthetic is something that really comes from America and is deeply embedded in the civil rights struggles of the 1960s. And then, but also on the left, you have a be in, or a be out in this case, which was a kind of a new technique of performativity that involved large groups of people really going out and misbehaving in public together. And that's something that has roots in the happenings movement, but also in a lot of other radical causes that are swirling around in places like the East Village in New York in the 1960s. So that is a flyer that I'm very fond of for various reasons. The culmination of this post-war era is really 1968, and again, I try to look at both Europe and America, but only very briefly, and just to say that this is a moment where you have a lot of new techniques combining with old techniques, coming together in a way that really explodes all over the world. And just taking a very few examples of that. The death of a man that you see on the right is actually a response to the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, April 1968. And there's kind of a complicated story there, but suffice it to say, it's a very interesting piece that speaks to a lot of the strategies that have come out of this mix of radical art and activism in both Europe and America in the post-war era. After that, the historical overview concludes downstairs with a look at the new movements and the way in which the culture of art and protest really changes quite a lot after 68, in the aftermath of 68. In many ways bringing it much closer to the kind of activism and the landscape of activism and art that we might be more familiar with today. And in large part that involved certainly new techniques coming into play, but also new groups, new agents, as I call it, new people who weren't necessarily represented in the notion of social struggle, the struggle for freedom and justice leading up till 68. So beyond class and race, you have a whole panoply of other causes, from environmentalism to gay and lesbian rights, and trans identity, to also the Native American movement really was just getting its start really in '68. I mean, that's a slight exaggeration, but really in terms of the huge impact that the American Indian movement, AIM, and the Red Power movement had on protest culture across the world, really in the 1970s, is something that I focus on there. So that's a very quick sense of what that narrative looks like. Along the way, I introduce a lot of different techniques, strategies, tactics, but also some of the issues and the conflicts. I mentioned class and race as being one. Another one that comes through over and over again is the relationship between radical art and militancy, and the question of violence, which is something that I come back to upstairs, where instead of taking a chronological view of things upstairs, I've taken a more thematic approach. And my goal there is to mix up material from different time periods, some of it quite recent, and some of it further back, some of it from America, some of it from Europe, but basically just trying to establish a dialogue and say, hey, here are some common issues and common approaches that you can see everywhere, and here's how I think these movements can talk to each other and talk to us today. One of the large curved cases, if you're familiar with the upstairs cases at Beinecke, is devoted to the question of media. And just a few of the images that are shown there, essentially looking at how art can be used very effectively as a way to create counter narratives that go against the mainstream media and its way of depicting the struggle for social justice and really getting that message out there. And that starts, well, in this analysis here anyway, with 1968, culmination in itself, but a moment when you have really a lot of alternative media being put out there. The posters, the very famous posters from 1968 in Paris, are really just part of a whole network of flyers and other means of disseminating messages that are meant to reach the people in a way to say, hey, what you're hearing on the news isn't necessarily what's going on here. That leads into a really fantastic worldwide web of underground zines that are associated with the underground press initially, press syndicate initially, and then really just is something that continues to be very active today. So over on the right, you can see a flyer from a homographic convergence zine festival, queer zine convention from the 1990s, to just kind of explore how that kind of use of art and counter media has really taken root already before. I said World Wide Web, but this is really before the web, of course. But the continuities there are really interesting and something that I try to get people to think about. The large yellow piece in the middle is just one example of the situationist tactics of détournement, this scavenging and mashing together of different messages that are from the media in ways that are highly provocative and intended to really short circuit that very sophisticated use of text and image in modern media to influence our behavior. Just a couple of other strategies and tactics that I focus on. One is bodies and performativity. There's a very long section that goes through that. These are just two examples of feminist performance, one from Italy in 1977, and the other one from a few years earlier in Austria, a woman named Vali Export who used her own body as a sign action. And this is just one of the pieces on display from that. Those two images are quite different in the sense that they also get at the way in which the body, but also images and art in general can be used in different ways. Some of them can be really very much about beauty and harmony, but there are also ways that art can be used to be very disruptive and actually even harmful in a way that I think is something that the show tries to get people to think about a bit more. Another also closely related to performativity is the notion of prefiguration. The idea that art can instead of opposing the present, can actually create in a way models of the future, kind of try to realize what our vision of the future is. And those often took the form and often continue to take the form of occupying physical space and then using it in a way. Here you have an example from Germany, the Kommune Eins, and then the American Indian movement's occupation of Alcatraz Island, which is just a fantastic example of a very artistic and creative way of prefiguring community. I mentioned violence before. The other large curve case is really focused on this question, it's obviously a very difficult question, and I don't want to do anything more here than point out that it's a question that I do try to raise here. What is the relationship between art and militancy? It's a difficult question to answer. But it also speaks to the fear that many people have that art really just isn't enough, that you need to do something more to art. So many people, and you're looking at on the left side, you can see this is a poster, a painting that was done by one of the poster artists in Paris in 1968, depicting the conflicts and clashes with police that really lead to a lot of radicalization, the militancy that you see emerging toward the end of the 60s and 70s. The other is our two manifestos published in a magazine called Rat by a group called Up Against the Wall Motherfucker, who are a group of former artists who decided in 1968 they have to start doing art and they have to become more involved in direct action, as they put it. That is a very complicated set of issues. I don't want to try to do any more here than to encourage you to confront those issues, and if you can come to the show, maybe take a look at the items on display and think about them. Another big controversy issue is, on the other hand, violence is on one side. On the other hand, is co-optation. Really, that art can easily become something that is used to mask and conceal conflict, and even to justify institutions that are in some way complicit with the system that artists, activist artists anyway, are trying to change. And at the end of the exhibition, I apologize for the photo here, it's got some glare in it, but it's a photograph from one of the art strikes in New York at the end of the 1960s, directed against MoMA. And it's really a moment where you have the beginning of a very powerful institutional critique of places like MoMA and the Met in New York and the Guggenheim were all targets of attack there, but also, really, frankly, of institutions like ours, like Beinecke, which is an institution that is, in a way, part of the establishment. And many people are very critical of the way in which museums and libraries can try to co-opt something that is intended to be really oppositional, and instead they turn it into something that is part of the system. this is a question that really deeply touches me personally because my own collecting, raises that question. Is it right for me to be bringing these artifacts to a library, to be displaying them under glass, rather than leaving them out in the realm of conflict on the street, as many people have put it? The center of social struggle is where these things belong. Is that right? And that's how the show really ends, with that question. And in the final vitrine of the exhibition, I actually leave part of it empty to ask you, the audience, what your view is. What would you put here? Would you put anything here? Should it even be here at all? I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but if I have time, people always ask, what is your favorite?
You're doing fine on time.
Doing fine on time? Okay. What is your favorite object? And it's really a hard thing to say. The show is just so full of things. And I, I mean, I just showed you a few images that I had at hand. There's so much more in the show. It's really, and it covers such a wide range of topics and ground. It's really like comparing apples and oranges a lot of the time. But this is the image I finally settled on as one that I think really is very near and dear to me, to my own heart. And I'd just like to talk to you about it for just a moment. It's an image from an Italian underground zine called Get Ready. It was published in the early 1970s in Milan. And it's an image that really brings together a lot of what I've been talking about here in the show. In particular, brings together several of the strategies that will look familiar to people, hopefully by this point in the exhibition, if you come and go through it, and if you're familiar with art protests at all, probably you'll immediately recognize. I certainly did. The first time I saw this image, it just really struck me. It's an image that is the title above it is the Underground Revolution, and what you have here is an image of Karl Marx. Well, actually, the face of Karl Marx, which has been grafted onto Delacroix's image of Marianne, who's the allegorical embodiment of the French Revolution. So you have Marx dressed as Marianne, so really a cross-dressed Marx, marching across this purple field with a banner. He's got a bayonet in one hand, and he's got the revolutionary flag in the other. And he's marching over a montage of all sorts of different images, but the images that really stand out to me, there are images of feminists in here, there are images of fists, there are images of student protesters and rallies, and it's an image that really brings together the kind of photo montage that I started off showing you a bit with John Hartfield's photo montage. It's very much alive and well, although greatly updated in this wonderful image. But it's also an image that brings in the situationist technique of détournement, that scavenging, that subversive combination of things in a way that I had never seen before. I saw this particular image. It's also an image that reflects the tremendous changes that have gone on in art and protest through the course of the last century, in terms of what I mentioned towards the end of the historical part, which is that you really have the emergence of a completely different landscape of social movements and social causes here. And this image is, again, it's from Italy in I think it's 71, this image, but it's an image that appears in the aftermath of 68. And it's an image that really speaks to tremendous transformation in Europe that happened at the same time as in America, where you get that similar combination of different movements. A lot of different people who considered themselves really marginalized and not part of the traditional leftist approach of, what is the struggle for social justice? Well, it's class struggle, or it's class struggle and race struggle. But what about all these other groups? And what about all these other people who are really a victim of oppression in their society? They should also be part of this, what the Italians called the young proletariat, which was a movement that was a class that was no longer being defined in terms of really class as we traditionally understand it, in terms of occupation or anything like that, but really in terms of gender and in terms of ecology, in terms of lifestyle, in terms of just a lot of different movements coming together and swirling around together to create a tremendous synergy that ultimately exploded in Italy in 1977 with the movement 77, Movimento del 77, which is really something that you can see already in this image here. So it's an image that I really like for a lot of reasons. It's incredibly creative. It's incredibly sophisticated in the way that it really draws on so many diverse aspects of art and protest. And it's an image that actually this is the image that inspired me to go ahead at the age of more than 50 years old to learn Italian so that I could go to Italy and try to capture this fantastic protest culture that had really flourished there in the 1970s. I needed to understand what these things said, and I needed to understand. Then I realized I needed to be able to talk to these people. Most of them don't speak English. That's why, that's one of the real reasons why this fantastic collection of movements is so unknown in America, is because everything's in Italian. So it's something that really had an enormous impact on my collection development. I've spent a lot of time collecting this kind of material in Italy over the last 10, 15 years. And it's something that then consequently has also had a big impact on the collections at Beinecke. So with that, I also just want to, at the end, conclude by saying thank you to Beinecke's for allowing me to have had this tremendous opportunity to build collections in ways that I don't think anyone was expecting, but that has really allowed us to become, I think, a place where people can come to recover the kinds of forgotten, or neglected, or underappreciated voices that Michael started out the program by talking about. So with that, I'll stop.